Good evening. It is 7 o'clock. Can people hear me? Doesn't sound like this is on. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Miss Wu,
Here.
Mr. Evans,
Here.
Miss Hersey,
Here.
Miss Colasetti,
Here.
Miss Bishop,
Here.
Miss Wilkin,
Here.
Mr. Quisenberry,
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here.
I think the mayor's is the only one that's on.
No, they're all on. They're just gonna adjust the volume just a little by little.
All right. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. And I do not have the date on my agenda.
There are no minutes.
There are no minutes. All right, well, that's why I don't have a date. Okay, the next item is public input and presentations. If anybody would like to address the committee of the whole, please come up to the mic in the front of the room. And you will have 5 minutes. You can please state your name.
Is it on? Hi. Good evening, City Council and fellow residents. I'm Tracy. Mayor Marlin, you lied again to City Council members last week. You lied to the public last week. When pressed on the issue of allowing public input both in person and via Zoom, you claimed that you did not say that it would be a violation of the Illinois Open Meetings Act, the OMA. Well, last July, Mayor Marlin, you even claimed that you consulted with both Urbana City Attorney and folks at the Illinois Municipal League, and that allowing public input both via Zoom and in person was not allowed under the OMA. So, what were you thinking last week? Why did you make that claim when Councilmember Grace Wilkin brought up the issue? Why do you constantly lie to us, to the public, and your fellow council members? If you want to address me now, you can, because this has been going on for for many instances over the past few years. City council members, all of you are aware of this lie, as well as the numerous lies that Mayor Marlin has told over the years, and that has been backed by evidence. After I emailed each of you last week, this was met with silence. I'm really curious. I'm standing here wondering what this means. All of you saw the evidence. Not one of you said anything. Not one of you replied to my email. Are you sitting here in silence in support of Mayor Marlin? Are you? Are you sitting here saying that it's okay for Mayor Marlin to lie to the public over and over again, especially when it comes to important issues, especially when it comes to issues of transparency, accessibility, accountability? What are you doing sitting here? What is your responsibility to the public, to the residents, to your constituents? I want to hear something tonight. I'm going to keep coming back. This is the same for issues such as FOIA issues, the recurrent requester issues. I spoke last week. You guys have been made aware of how the city has incorrectly designated people as recurrent requesters. Yet you sit here quiet. Yes, it was last week. After I brought it up, not a single one of you responded to my concerns. And I'm really wondering why. Is it because it's difficult? Is it because you don't care? Please let me know. This is the same regarding CPRB issues. I have brought it up, other members of the public have brought it up, residents have brought it up, but we still have no resolution. You guys, again, is it because it's difficult? You guys just sit there quietly. No response. I'm met with silence and blank stares. Why am I even here? Do you think I have nothing better to do at night? Thank you.
Before you leave, I don't believe we got your last name. Would you state your last name for the record, please?
No.
All right. Would anybody else like to address the committee of the whole this evening?
Good evening. I'm James Kilgore. I live at 602 East Harding Drive in Urbana. I want to speak to the ARPA funds and Urbana's process or changing process on this. Just to go back to the foundation, the ARPA bill was passed on March 12th of 2021, and it was designed specifically to address the impact of COVID-19. The 5 key areas that were highlighted were to address the negative economic impacts, to address premium pay for essential workers, to try to cover budget shortfalls, that is, shortages in public sector revenue that came about because of COVID-19, to try to cover some of the public health crises that emerged because of COVID-19, mental health, of course, physical health, community violence, a whole range of public health issues which were central to this. And lastly, to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. I know that you're aware of this because you've been following this for quite some time since it came out. But at the same time, what's happened nationally seems to be also creeping into Urbana. So what's happening nationally is that these 5 main purposes for ARPA funds, the idea that ARPA funds are really about things that were impacted by ARPA has kind of shifted off the agenda. So in Alabama, money's being set aside to build 2 prisons from the ARPA funds. In Los Angeles and Chicago, millions of dollars is being set aside for policing and police equipment as part of ARPA funds. These are not things that were impacted by ARPA. It's making a twisted argument to try to say that we need new prisons because we had a COVID-19 epidemic. So I'm concerned about how the city of Urbana is addressing this issue of the standard allowance, which seems to be allowing cities to set aside $10 million pretty much to spend as they see fit. That is, outside of the boundaries of those major purposes of the original proposition. That's not saying that they can't be spent on that, but it gives cities, counties, etc., license to spend money on things that really are not ARPA related. So, and I want to give a relevant example because I think it's important to do that. Fire stations are not impacted by ARPA. So to say that we want to spend money on fire stations from the ARPA funds is really kind of distorting the original purpose of the ARPA funds. So what I'm going to call for is the city of Urbana has set in place a plan to decide how to spend those ARPA funds. You're all aware of that plan. That plan was to begin in the fall of 21, go to the spring of 22 to do research. The next phase was from the spring of 22 to the fall to develop a concept plan and to develop a process by which organizations or other bodies would apply for funds. And then in the fall of 2022, online application forms would be accepted and they would go through a vetting process, much like other ways in which people in the community apply for funds from the city. So I'm going to argue that as imperfect as that original process may have been, as frustrated as some of us were at the time for how long that was going to take, it still, to me, now looks better than just opening this thing up and letting everyone come forward without any criteria, without any guidelines, and pitching for money and then not having any systematic way to evaluate what people are asking for. So I'm really concerned about this standard allowance. I'm really concerned that we end up with a chaotic process, possibly a corrupt process, if we don't stick to the original plan, which seems to have been well thought out, well planned, and agreed upon by the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak to the Committee of the Whole this evening? All right, seeing none.
You could do staff report while we're waiting, if you want to do that.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do staff report.
Okay.
That sounds good.
All right. So I know we've gotten questions, and Dave's going to need to sit here. We've gotten questions about Dr. Ellis, and we promised a presentation. I just want to give you a date for that. We've been told that Public Works is going to be ready on May 2nd. So we'll have a very extensive history of the Dr. Ellis issues so that people are have a factual understanding moving forward about what that is. And I will send the summary that I had sent to council a couple years ago in advance of that, so you have that as background. And then I believe Dave was going to. Oh, you're going to do a memo? Okay, okay. And then if you wanted to just start into the business, and when we get the PowerPoint up, we can do our presentation.
Yes, Grace?
Thank you. Thanks for the update on the upcoming presentation for the Dr. Ellis neighborhood. And along with that history, could that also include cost estimates? I know it might be like kind of contingency, different situations, but some idea of a dollar figure.
We'll do the best we can with some, they have to be sort of back of the envelope types of things, but we'll have that.
Could you explain more of the back of the envelope, meaning like different outcomes depending on if we do a bigger repair job or less, or what you mean by that?
So there are implications depending on what the council perceives as the issue that you want to address. If there is an issue that you want to address, prior councils have not considered there to be an issue that they wanted to address. So depending on the scope of what it is that you might like to address, there'll be some ballpark figures that the Public Works folks will have prepared in advance. If you ask a question that they didn't anticipate, we won't have a cost estimate for that. So we'll have some general figures based on the kinds of questions we've gotten in the past. But if you ask a question that we haven't contemplated, we won't have a number for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious on the number of, full replacement, kind of what that would look like, if that's possible for them to include. I don't know if that's already one of your situations.
I'm just going to make a statement here that I don't think that anyone, even the people in the Dr. Ellis subdivision who perceive that there's a problem, think that full replacement is required. So estimating that, that's not something we're going to be doing. But Tim is he's very good with, per linear foot kinds of numbers that he has at hand, but I don't think anyone's advocating for that particular solution. Okay.
All right, it sounds like we have our microphones back. Well, Clerk, if we need to rearrange the agenda, do we need any kind of vote?
Yeah, that's normally done during additions to the agenda, but if you would like to change the order to shift the presentation to later in the meeting, you should vote.
All right, if it's okay with the staff member who was going to present, if we could go through the 1, 2, 3, down to the 10th item on the agenda, and then slot in the presentation there. Is that okay? All right, can I have a motion to move the agenda below item number 9?
So moved.
Second? A second?
I'll second.
All right, moved by Chandra and seconded by Jaya. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? All right, that has been moved. Thank you very much. Now, we can attempt to do our presentation again.
Oh, we don't see it here.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about diversity procurement information for the city of Urbana. Can you hear me? Okay.
speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
Okay. We can advance. Total procurement for the city of Urbana is approximately $16 million annually. This figure includes goods and services procured by the city of Urbana from all funds, not just the general fund. It does not include salaries and benefits, grants, transfer payments, and the like. It also includes some goods and services for which there are no vendors listed on the CDAP, for example, vendors for vehicles, and it includes purchases made using joint purchasing arrangements. Grants used to procure services are reported to HUD separately, and we have a separate slide on this information because we have a more detailed information on those expenditures. Since January 1, 2018, the city of Urbana has procured at least $1,157,064 in goods and services from WBE, MBE firms. We say at least because the expenditures included here only include those that we could specifically identify as being paid to a CDAP-listed firm or another firm that we know to be either MBE or WBE that is not listed on the CDAP. There are 22 CDAP firms in this number and another 10 non-CDAP firms. The reason we don't have a clearer picture is that payments made to a prime contractor are the only ones that we are tracking at this time. We know there are subcontractors used on a variety of Urbana jobs that are MBE or WBE, but if the city doesn't pay them directly, then we don't have record of them, of those payments, and they're not included in the amount. This pie chart illustrates that based on payments we specifically identify that the city made to WBE, MBE firms over the last 4-ish calendar years, about 2% went to those firms. As I mentioned before, we believe that number is higher, but we don't have the definitive data to prove it, and so we are not including that in this number. This graph does not reflect the full complement of CBDG and home funds expended every year. Rather, it includes the contractor and subcontractor activity paid for with CDBG and home funds for things like housing rehabilitations and repairs. Our staff is required to report these figures separately to HUD on an annual basis, so we have a higher level of granularity than with the majority of city funds. What you can see here is the percentages for WBE and MBE contracting are much better here, although the overall amounts are modest relative to the rest of the city's procurement. In FY 2020, for instance, MBEs accounted for 31% of all procurements for the CDBG and home funds procurements, with another 5% for WBEs. In FY 2021, the combined total for all procurements for MBE, WBE firms was 2/3, 67% of the total. And I've been using CDAP, and I wasn't sure if you were all familiar with CDAP, but it stands for Champaign Diversity Advancement Program. We also wanted to share a little bit of background with you about the CDAP list, just so that you all know what it is. There are a total of 114 firms on that list. This chart illustrates the percentages of firms that are MBE, WBE, as well as those that identify as both.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second. I don't know why the categories are saying category name versus the actual category, so maybe you could just read them off.
Oh, sure. The 45% pie part is MBE. The 33% pie chart in the front, in the top there, it is WBE, and then there are 22% MBE, WBE combined.
33% as well?
It is WBE. And I'll give you a moment to look at that. Do we not have category name? Okay, well then I can give you those categories really quickly. I'll start with the bottom right there. That's construction, which is 36%. 7%. Next to that is engineering, which is 8%. The next one is going up clockwise. Supply procurement is 8%. Landscaping, 5%. Janitorial, 3%. Other than City of Urbana procures, others that the City of Urbana procures is 12%. And then the top right is products and services City of Urbana does not procure, which is 31%, which is 27%. Okay. Oh, these are the CDAP listings of the types of businesses that are listed in that program, and then we kind of categorize them by type. We believe it's important to understand as well what business sectors are represented on the CDAP list, which is to answer, Ms. Wilkin. This is a general categorization rather than detailed analysis. So if the numbers of the firms in a particular category are a little off by one or two, please, focus on the general point we're making. The first thing I want to call to your attention is that roughly 31 of the CDAP firms, which is about 27%, provides goods and services that the city would never procure and would very infrequently procure. Examples of that would be like fueling stations, nanny placements, photography services, medical patient transportation, those kinds of things. The second point is that the single most represented trade category is construction, with 41 firms, or more than 1/3 of the total, representing all types of construction, including buildings, concrete, sewer, infrastructure, and the like. Engineering firms, also generally related to construction, represent another 8% of the total, which is 9 firms. The prevalence of MBE, WBE firms in construction helps explain why the CDBG and home numbers are as high as they are. They are spent almost exclusively on construction-related items. Because so many firms are in the construction business and some of our largest single procurements are for construction, we want to focus on increasing opportunities for these firms in particular, which leads to the networking event that I'm actually glad that Carol's going to talk about, that we're planning with the assistance of Mariah Madison of Head Start Marketing. And Carol is going to explain further about that event and give more details.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the networking event that we're planning, we've been talking over many months actually with some of our jurisdictional partners, so the Park District and Champaign County in particular, but we often have conversations with the school district and with the sanitary district and so on about what we can do collaboratively to advance contracting with MBE and WBE firms. And so since all 3 of the listed participants that are confirmed, so the city, the Park District, and Champaign County, we all have big procurements for what I think Public Works people call vertical construction, so buildings as opposed to roads. And because we have the fire station projects coming up, the Park District has the Health and Wellness Center coming up, and Champaign County, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but they bought County Plaza office building, and they're going to be making a very significant investment in renovating that building. So we all have these similar kinds of projects, and the networking event is a variation of something that I participated in when I was in the federal government, where we bring likely prime contractors together with WBE and MBE subcontractors who are represented, as Carla said, more than 1/3 of the firms that are on the CDAP list, and we introduce them to each other and encourage them to make connections and business relationships, and we tell them, we're going to be building a fire station here, we're going to be building a fire station there, where Champaign County is going to be renovating this building, Urbana Park District is going to be building this health and wellness center, and there may be other partners that have projects as well, and we give them a sense of the scope of the project so they know what trades they're going to need. We give them a sense of timing so they can get their partnerships in place, so when they do those bids, they they are, they've anticipated, and it's not like, oh, wow, we have 60 days to put a team together. They have well in advance of that. So we're giving this a try. Mariah has got a great plan together for helping us do the reach out to people and the follow up with the subcontractors, and so we're excited to give this a try. Tentatively scheduled for the week of May 23rd. We're still kind of bouncing around on finding a precise date that works for everybody, but that's well in advance of anybody going out for bid on any of these major projects that I mentioned. So this is something that we can support with the staff that we have. And, you know, Park District and the county are in the same position as we are. They do not have dedicated staff to work on this. So we're excited to give this a try. And with that, I think we're available to answer any questions. And I apologize. I got a text that the reason why not all of these the slides aren't showing up is I think it has to do with updating whatever computer they're being shown on. So I apologize. There's a very good-looking set of slides that we will send to you.
All right, questions? Chandra?
Okay, so I think I know what WBE and MBE stand for, but can you?
Women-owned business enterprise and minority-owned business enterprise.
James?
Yeah, I was wondering if going forward, part of the process of winning a primary contract would include that those primary contractors give us a breakdown of the subcontractors that they use that are WBE or MBE.
So
so that we would have that deeper for those larger things that we've done. We know that there's in there, but the money's not touching Urbana directly. Could we make that part of the reporting expectation?
Yes, we can, and I think where things sort of have been I don't want to say falling apart, but they've been falling short of expectations. Is first of all that we don't require that reporting, but then it's also that there's an organic quality to some of our contracting. So the example that I like to use is one that I was involved in selecting the firm for our stormwater management plan, and everybody was encouraged. It wasn't a requirement, but people were encouraged to put together a diverse team that included either WBE participation or MBE participation. And so the firm that was selected had a WBE firm that was going to do the community or the public outreach part. And then COVID hit. And so that the amount of work that was contemplated up front turned out to be less than the percentage. And so that would be great on the reporting, so that other than my anecdotal story to say that, but it's hard to, I think where it becomes challenging, and I know this is a step that's down the road for us, is when we get to the point where we're doing something that's a requirement versus an aspirational goal. And that's something that's going to take more work. And also, and I think the reason why it's important to understand how the contractor community, as reflected on CDAP, breaks down is not every procurement is conducive to MBE and WBE participation. So the example that Carla gave was there's no one on the list that sells vehicles, for instance, and we procure a couple $1 million worth of vehicles on average every year. So having any kind of requirement for vehicle procurement is we're not gonna be able to be successful there. So we really need to know what we're going to be procuring, and Champaign does this. They sit down. They have the staff that can sit down. I don't know what their threshold for procurements is, but they sit down with the list, and they sit down with the folks who are going to be doing the procurement, and they say, let's set a goal that reflects the community that the contractor community that we can draw on. So there's obviously a lot of room for us to do a better job. The purpose of this is to give you sort of a fact base to work from going forward.
Grace?
Thank you. I was wondering about the possibility, as you said, with kind of staff being one of the limiting factors on that. And I believe Mr. Thompson brought up the idea of having a new position for compliance officer. And I was just wondering what your kind of inside perspective was, or if there's a way to kind of combine it, like maybe another position or assistant under Carla's office, or I don't know. I was just wondering your thoughts on how that could work with having the proper staff.
Do you want me to take that one? Okay. All right. So we're aware of the fact that more staff would help us do better. We're also aware that the council just recently passed strategic goals and for us to prioritize, and then the budget will be coming forward from the mayor in another, it's coming fast, another month and a half, I guess. And so there will be prioritization reflected there. And then at that point, I mean, there's many things that we could do better if we had more staff. So we'll be balancing all of that out, and you'll see how that, where the mayor stands on that in her proposed budget, and then it'll be in the hands of the council.
Any thoughts on like how that could work in particular, like what office or anything, or that's still kind of too far down the road?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think an obvious place would be in Carla's office. However, we've also talked about the fact that the department that could use the most assistance in procurement in general is Public Works, and Public Works procures more than any other department, unless you're buying a fire vehicle or something on that odd year. But by and large, on an annual basis, Public Works does the most. So if it's possible that would be another place for it. Although typically, I think most governments like to centralize things related to procurement. So a central location would be executive, and Carla's part of executive.
All right. Chandra?
You mentioned that a lot of the subcontractors were women and minorities, but what about the primary contractors? You don't really see that too often? I don't know that there are any large prime, general large prime contractors on the CDAP list. There are people that are general contractors, and I think one of the things we want to learn through this networking event is, are there people here locally that we're not aware of that could handle, as a general contractor, a $5 million building. We know of at least one, and I think there might be another one out of Chicago that we fully expect will bid, that is a minority-owned firm, a general contractor. And so we're looking forward to them participating. They will be invited to come to the networking event. Even though they're from Chicago, we don't have there's not a local piece to the goals that we set. It's minority and women-owned. So, I guess, I don't know if this is like the city's place, but how do we help those smaller primary contractors build capacity so that they can bid on these larger projects?
I think it's kind of complicated. I mean, that's what the small business, what is it, SBA, Small Business Administration, that's what they do. I think there's a lot of different approaches that the SBA uses, and part of it is understanding what is the challenge for any one company. I think, another thing that happens sometimes is that smaller companies build a relationship with a larger company, and the larger company facilitates them sort of growing. They mentor them, and they end up not being competitors, but they end up, because one is so much bigger than the other, but because of relationships that they build up,
they, the larger company is willing to mentor the smaller company. So it's really a lot about relationships, and so that's why, again, why the networking event is so important, is we want to facilitate the relationships that people need, and I think that's something that's really been lacking. So we'll find some people, I think, that are willing to really help move the needle on this.
Chris?
Thanks for the presentation. So I just want to understand this. Each year, the city of Urbana does $16 million of procurement. I mean, all the procurements is $16 million, right?
Yes,
That's
approximately.
each year,
yeah.
okay. So for 4 years, we would have spent in procurements about $64 million then.
Yes.
Probably, okay. So for the last 4 years, we've barely spent $1 million for minority business enterprises and women business enterprises. Is that what you're telling me? For 4 years, a little over 1 million
Yes.
out of that 64 million.
Yeah, but the one thing I do want to say, even though you're right, the calculus you just did is absolutely correct, but the amount of money that we spend over that same time period on CDBG and home procurements for the rehabs and the repairs is over 800,000. So in combination, even though those numbers are not included in the 64 million, they're more modest numbers, it's almost 2 million, which I'm not saying that's
Okay, so
that's
this
good
is
enough,
important.
but that's the fact.
So Carol, what you're saying is that some of that home money is definitely going to the minority and women-owned
Yes.
business.
Yes.
And that's not in the, okay, I got you.
Right, and that's why there was a separate bar graph that,
Okay.
because Sheila and her staff report on that with a high level of granularity to HUD.
Okay. Is CDAP policy going to be posted on our website? Or is it already posted on our website?
We don't have a CDAP policy per
okay.
se.
All right. So what is our policy? I mean, sort of catch as catch can, or what are we doing?
Minority and women owned. I don't know that we have one that has specific goals. I mean, I think we have some aspirational statements in
Sure,
various
sure,
policies,
sure.
but I don't know that we have specific goals.
Well,
anymore.
I bring that up because I noticed that in the city of Champaign, their aspirational goals are 10% minority, 5% women-owned businesses. Carla, did you see that too? Okay. So that they've established some percentage goals. Are we looking to do that at any time in the future, or do we know?
I think that makes sense, but again, I think we need to understand the contractor community better.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
having across-the-board goals is
Yeah.
not going to work because we don't have, in Washington, D.C., for instance, where I came from, there's a very, very robust contractor community. Every sector is represented, and I worked in district government. Every department, every agency is required on an annual basis to meet certain goals, and you report out in an oversight hearing how you've succeeded. That gives you a sense of every department, whatever it is that you're procuring, there's an opportunity for you to buy things from minority, well, they call them LSDBEs, local small disadvantaged business enterprises, and there's a high emphasis on local in DC.
Yeah.
So we just don't have that. We don't have that level of minority and women ownership here of the companies that we need to procure. We might want to start by setting a goal for in the construction sector. That might be a place to start because we know we have a pretty robust community there.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a third. Carla mentions it's a third that's in the construction, and then it's another 8% in engineering. So that's a pretty good representation in things related to construction.
Okay. So kind of parse out who's local and who's not. you said there's 22 CDAP firms, and then there's a figure of 114 firms. So who's who here? I mean, do we know? Or?
We don't have the granular information on who's in Urbana versus who's, because their CDAP
Yeah.
fits all over the
Sure.
state and sometimes out of the state.
I think we'd be comfortable if it was Champaign-Urbana because,
Yeah.
you know, everybody shops and lives in both communities. Okay. I'm going to let somebody else talk. Oh, ask a question.
All right, other questions? Carol, I'd have to agree with Chris and your statement, which is I think the easiest place to start here is where we know we have known people who do the work and to set some goals in terms of what percentage we hope to obtain and step it up over a course of the years. You talked about the $16 million that we purchase. Does that include all of our capital projects?
Yes.
Okay. So, in the capital projects, do you have any rough approximation of the percentage of the 16 million?
I don't. I can go back and look. I got a really good report from finance about that. I can go back and look, and it was averaged over a 4-year period. So, and you know, the capital projects are kind of up and down. We could probably come up with some kind of estimate out of that.
I think that would be helpful if we had that. I mean, certainly buying a ladder truck is what, $1.5 million, but that's every 20 years, roughly speaking. But our capital projects are not chump change. All right, Chandra?
So you mentioned that we don't have a vehicle procurement thing, but like does Champaign have a vehicle procurement who is a minority owned or no?
There's no one on the CDAP list.
Okay.
So, and there's no one that, so we have, as Carla mentioned, we have identified at least 10 other firms that are WBE, MBE that are not on CDAP that we have done business with over the 4 years that we reported on. But I'm not aware of any that are within, you know, the market area that we would procure from. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but we might be looking farther afield. But
Right.
just looking at the CDAP list, we wanted to give an example of something that there isn't anybody, and vehicle purchasing is not on the list.
And then, so those 10 businesses that you have done, that you know are MBE or WBE, did you like let Champaign know that they exist and should be added to the list?
Oh,
or?
we're going to be reaching out to them to encourage them to get on the list.
Okay.
Just because they're, you know, vendors of ours.
And is it, what's the word? Is it, I guess, too much to ask that we do look beyond, I guess, is it appropriate to look beyond our geographical region so that we are looking for more WBEs and MBEs, say for the vehicle procurement? So like if we begin to establish these goals, like, and we have to move outside of our geographical area, is that appropriate to do so?
Well, I think at some point that's going to be for you all to decide. I mean, there is a cost factor when you start to go, depending on what you're procuring. For instance, vehicles are a good example. You have to get them. You have to get them from wherever they are to where you are. So if we're buying from, you know, a couple states over, then you're adding cost to the procurement because you have to get the vehicles to you. So I think, again, it will depend on, you know, at that point, we might want to say, well, how far would we have to go to get an MBE or WBE firm? And we could say, oh, well, you only have to go to Indiana, or you have to go to Ohio, and then it becomes a different conversation. I think some of these, as we explore them, we're going to have to actually study who's available to do this work and go from there.
Do these lists include veteran-owned businesses?
I think there are a few that are indicated, but not really called out on the list. Are there some? Yeah.
So which group do they go into? Which two of the buckets do the veterans go into?
I don't know that anybody was exclusively veteran-owned.
on the CDAP list. I'm pretty sure that nobody was exclusively veteran. So they're in whatever other bucket they're, yeah.
Okay, all right. Any, Grace?
Thank you. I was just trying to understand CDAP a little better too, because this is a City of Champaign initiative, correct? That Urbana has also provided a few thousand in financial support. Is that correct? And that it is kind of a regional list. Is that right? It looks like it's kind of Champaign, Decatur, and then are there also maybe statewide agencies as well? And do we have like plans or thoughts? Would this be, so like when we do this event and help add to the list as part of our collaboration, how would that work with the relationship with the City of Champaign on this joint list effort? Like, would you be updating their list with our events, you said, as we find out new contractors?
Well, we would encourage the contractors that we identify to sign up for the CDAP program. And they would get registered, and then they will get the Champaign certification of they are minority-owned or women-owned or veteran-owned and then that, with that list, then we can access that list at any time, and so can they. And hopefully, it would be an opportunity for all of the categories to be able to procure, get contracts.
Okay, so you're saying it's the responsibility of the firm rather than the city to
Yes.
update the list by applying?
But we can steer them there.
Thank you.
Jaya?
Just as a point of clarification, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I think that, having that reference point of, as we're encouraging purchasing from women-owned and minority-owned businesses, if we don't have folks who are registered in those categories, that's an important piece of information for us to have. You mentioned, though, that a lot of the subcontractors and some of the other contractors that we work with might not be on that list, and that's something, just to clarify, are we going to try to track that, right? So in addition to having that reference point of CDAP, which obviously is a great resource, I think if we're finding that there are categories of businesses that we are working with that are not captured in that, that seems like it would be valuable information so that we're not underestimating how many women-owned or minority-owned
Oh, sure,
businesses we're
right.
working with as well. Because I'm hearing some of that, we don't have that granularity, we don't have that information. Is that something that we can do with the current staffing?
Well, I think, I don't know that we've been even that conscientious about inquiring, with the firms that we're contracting with. And I do know that we have the capacity in our financial system to track it. It's just not something that we have done. So I just think there's, like I said, this is a baseline, and there's lots of things that we can do. Some will be large and some will be small. But yeah, we're interested in, this has been very illuminating for us so far, just preparing this presentation.
That just seems like a concrete, tangible, like something
Absolutely.
that could be implemented easily if we have the technology to do so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I did look, I just scanned the list. There's only one firm that's veteran-owned. And they are not in another bucket. They're just,
All right.
they're just a veteran-owned firm.
Thank you. All right, any final questions? Chris, do you have a final question?
I do. Thank you. Well, I just want to thank you very much for doing this. And this is kind of where I was hoping we would go soon, to this kind of discussion and the mixer, or whatever we're calling it, May 23rd. I mean, I just want to emphasize, and I'm sure I'm talking to the choir here, that economic development in Urbana is going to be, or even Champaign-Urbana, is going to be critical. And it has to be on all fronts: parks, affordable housing, crime prevention, K through 12 education, job creation, neighborhood development, workforce development, small business development, and business retention are all part of an economic development plan. And I see CDAP, or whatever our procurement policy that we're going to call it, is critical, that the government of Urbana takes the lead in making sure that the economy is for everybody. And so I really appreciate the work you've done on this and how we're going about this. And I would really encourage us to keep after it. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So the first item of business is ordinance number 2022-04013, an ordinance amending Schedule J of Section 23-183 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code prohibiting parking at all times on certain streets for Cottage Grove Avenue. Public Works.
Okay. Good evening, council. Good evening, mayor. So at our April 6th Traffic Commission meeting, we considered an item that was brought to the commission by Brad Bennett of the Urbana-Champaign Sanitary District about concerns they have for the potential of on-street parking on North Cottage Grove from University Avenue to Park Street to inhibit their operations by effectively blocking the street for their vehicles to access their northeast plant. And so in considering this, there's part of the traffic code that provides for when a narrow street, in this case, I want to say it is less than 28 feet wide, or it is 28 feet wide, less than 30 feet. The traffic code allows for us to remove parking from one side because it's a narrow street and you just wouldn't really be able to fit parking on both sides and allow for through traffic with that width. So for the essential services that UCSD provides to the community to avoid the potential for, providing, and inhibiting that service, we recommended that the no parking be established on the east side of North Cottage Grove. And we did reach out to local residents, did not receive any response, and in communications with the Park District, because Ambucks Park is on the east side of North Cottage Grove, the Park District did not have any problems with that situation.
All right, any technical questions? All right, I'll entertain a motion if you so choose on the consent agenda.
I'd like to move that ordinance number 2022-04-013, an ordinance amending Schedule J of Section 23-183 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code prohibiting parking at all times on certain streets, Cottage Grove Avenue, be moved to council for approval.
Would you like that on the consent agenda?
Sure, yeah. Put that on the consent agenda.
All right, moved by Sharice and seconded by James. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, that moves forward. Next item is resolution number 2022-04033R, a resolution authorizing acceptance for a grant for Market at the Square, USDA Pandemic Relief and Protection Program of 2022. Sheila.
Thank you. This is a grant that we received through the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help us continue with Market at the Square during COVID. Qualified expenses were included rental hand wash statements, portable toilets, the purchase of materials such as fencing and rope, because the market outlaid the area so that it was a one-way traffic flow. We also hired additional staff to be able to continue with the market. And then we created online materials about safety procedures and marketing materials for the program. So the total grant is $11,099.
All right, any technical questions? All right, Sheila, if I remember correctly, there's a separate fund for the Market at the Square, and so this would just add to that specific fund, and then that fund rolls over every year.
Correct.
Okay. All right, I would entertain a motion.
I'll move approval of resolution number 2022-04-033R, a resolution authorizing acceptance of a grant for Market at the Square, USDA Pandemic Relief and Protection Program 2022, to the consent agenda with approval.
I'll second.
All right, moved by Jay and seconded by Chandra. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, that moves forward. Next item is resolution number 2022-0403R, 034R, a resolution approving the City of Urbana Home Consortium, Champaign-Urbana, Champaign County Annual Action Plan for fiscal year 2022-2023. Hello.
Good evening. Can everyone see the slides okay? Sorry. The City of Urbana Grants Management Division seeks approval of the City of Urbana and Urbana Home Consortium Annual Action Plan for the fiscal year 2022-2023. The one-year annual action plan outlines the activities the city and the consortium will undertake utilizing HUD funds throughout the following year. The plan also explains how these activities meet the goals, strategies, and objectives of the consolidated plan. So just an overview of the timeline here. The annual action plan will be completed electronically and submitted to HUD via the Integrated Disbursement and Information System, which is also known as IDIS. Successful completion of the plan will enable the city and the consortium to continue receiving Community Development Block Grant and Home Investment Partnership funding through HUD. Failure to submit the annual action plan by the deadline will result in significant delays in funding, which could have widespread programmatic impacts in the community. And failure to submit by the deadline could also result in the automatic loss of HUD funds to the city. So once the plan is submitted and approved, then the funding year will begin on July 1, 2022. So I'll just provide now a brief update of the public process. I shared a little bit about this last month when I presented. A draft of the plan was available for public review and comment from March 15th through April 15th, 2022. Staff held 3 virtual public hearings to gain citizen feedback on the plan and also presented the plan at various neighborhood groups in the community. Staff also solicited feedback from social service agencies in the community, including the Homestead Corporation, the Continuum of Service Providers to the Homeless, Community Reinvestment Group, and the Human Services Council of Champaign County. On March 22nd, the city's Community Development Commission reviewed the plan and was also provided an opportunity to comment. In addition, staff sent out 2 surveys to gather input on the plan and on needs in the community. One of the surveys was targeted toward Urbana residents, and the other plan was specifically tailored for homeless service providers in the community as well as housing advocates. So we really wanted to get input from not only residents but also people who are working in the field every day. We sent out the surveys via direct email, and they were also posted on the website and social media account, and as well as sent out to various listservs in the community. And we received over 40 individual responses to the survey, and a summary of the results of that survey, as well as the comment that we received to those surveys is included in the plan that's currently on the website. So you can view those comments and view the feedback that we received on that plan, on those surveys. So due to some delays at the federal level in Congress, HUD has not yet provided grantees with the specific allocations for fiscal year 2022-2023. However, HUD advises grantees to move forward with the annual action planning process in order to prevent any delays to funding. So the amounts that you see here for the CDBG program as well as the Home Investment Partnership Program, these were the amounts that we received in 2021, 2022, and we are expecting these amounts to remain consistent this upcoming year as well. At the recommendation of HUD, once we receive the final allocation amounts, we will be amending the budget to proportionally increase or decrease the estimated funding levels to match the actual allocations. HUD recommends this process in order to prevent any delays in funding. And staff has also used this procedure in the past when final allocations were not yet released by HUD at the time the plan was released. Again, we have that May 15th deadline, which is important for us to meet at this time. So Staff recommends approving the plan and submitting to City Council on the consent agenda. Thank you.
Technical questions. Apparently, we're not working anymore, but all right. Yes, Jaya.
This is a broader technical question, but can the community hear what's being discussed if the microphones are not working as a point of order?
I do not have an answer for that. Carol, would you be able to?
I actually think they're working. I just think that their volume has been, they're adjusting the volume. So I think if you speak closely into the mic, you will be you're being amplified.
I want to make sure that people watching the recording or watching us live are able to hear what's being discussed. So that's, yeah, if we. Well, that's good. But for folks watching. Yeah, just want to make sure that.
Sanford, if you have something that you would like to share, please.
Thank you. Please join us.
So one of the things to be aware of about the microphones is that much like on Zoom, when somebody has it on two at the same time, you can get a feedback loop. So some of you earlier were hearing feedback loops because microphones were on, people had left their microphones on, and it was picking up the sound from the speakers and it was creating a feedback loop. And so in order to avoid that, it sounded like they adjusted the volume downwards a little bit. So there's a happy medium there, but one of the things that we have to remember as people who are using the microphones is to turn them off when we're not speaking. That will help avoid the feedback loop.
Sanford, so even if we can't hear it as amplified voice, it still is being picked up by UPTV?
I'm not watching the stream, so I can't tell you right now what it's looking like on Channel 6 or other channels that are carrying it. We can continue to tweak the volume, and Anna, Brahma, maybe you can turn up the volume in the speakers, not as high as it was earlier, but a little higher, and that will assist people hearing that we're being mic'd. But also for council members and everyone else speaking, we should be speaking approximately a fist's distance from the microphone. That's important because sometimes we sit back too far and then we're not being picked up by the microphones. So just some basic sort of, use of the microphones.
All right, thank you.
Mary, I was going to add something to that.
Charisse?
We don't have monitors. So, and when I say we don't have monitors, what I mean is that we don't have speakers where we can hear ourselves. Everything that we say goes out into the gallery. So that's the difference in being able to, we can't hear out there, but I believe, can you guys hear out there? Can you hear me? So there we go. So it's just, it's because we can't hear ourselves. We don't have it's not Janet Jackson up here. We don't have this little thing in our ear or a little speaker coming back at us saying, oh yeah, you can, you're being amplified. So I think that's also part of the confusion.
All right. Thank you. James?
Can I suggest that when we do a voice vote, don't use your microphone, but the chair please announce the outcome of the vote so that people can know what happened. We can hear what happens up here with the voice vote, but if we all turn on our microphones and create the feedback loop, it's a problem. So if you would just announce the outcome of the voice vote, it would be helpful.
Good
Thanks.
idea. All right, thank you for the technical information about the microphones. Do we have any technical information about the home and the CDBG funds? Questions? Grace?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation and memo and answering some of my email questions earlier. I definitely need to go through the latest draft because unfortunately I spent a bit of time going through the older version that was online. So would this one be available for public review, or is it typically just the draft first?
It is currently available. it's been on the website, and the link was in the memo to the updated version that's on the community development page. So it can be a little bit tricky to find, but I tried to make that as easy as possible. But it is on the website. One thing I forgot to mention is that we did catch that there are some dates in the current plan that are outdated, and we've updated it already in our IDIS system. So if you see a date that says 2015, 2019, we saw that and we've changed it. So I apologize for any confusion.
Thank you. And then I was wondering about the administrative costs that I see for home. It's about 10% of the allocation, and that for the CDBG it's about 20%. So it's 10% for the home, and CDBG about 20. And I was wondering if there was a difference in that about how it's handled, the administrative costs.
That's mandated by HUD, so that's in HUD regulation. They mandate percentages for administrative costs, so that's reflected in that budget.
Thank you. And another general question, I'm still working on wrapping my head around how the grant funding for administrative services fits in with our budgeted salary lines. If that's kind of then the budgeted salary we had planned for goes into the general fund, if it's getting billed through the grant. I'm just having a hard time understanding how that works.
That will be a Sheila question.
Yeah, I thought it might be a complicated one. Thank you.
Yep. Braden and I are required, or any staff-funded position is required to do a timesheet where we allocate our time versus, how much we did. So, tonight's time is going to be split between home and CDBG. And then quarterly, the finance department will send us a list of what the total transfer amount is. We give them a listing of how we spent our time that last quarter, and then it's divided up proportionately that way.
I guess just my question is, because you're not grant funded positions, correct? Like you have a budgeted salary of X amount of dollars from the city, right?
Right now, since I'm doing the director's position, part of mine isn't, but Braden and I normally are 100% grant funded.
Okay, I think that's the part I was missing, because I was thinking that was full budgeted from the city budget, but you're saying a lot of it is dependent on grant funding exclusively.
Right, it's through the CDBG and home program, or like if we get ESG funding through the state, there's a small amount of admin time, budget that comes with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sheila, since you're here, so in the home grant allocations, we're the lead agency, and so we have the split between City of Champaign and the county. But CDBG funds, are we the lead agency there as well, because they're kind of tied together?
Each community receives their own CDBG allocation.
Okay.
But the consortia, which is Champaign, Urbana, and the Regional Planning Commission, receive that total allocation to share.
So the amount that Urbana can go to Urbana projects for the home fund is $172,000, but then in the CDBG funds, Urbana has $516,000. Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And the main difference between those two programs?
Home, kind of the basics is at the end of the project, you have to have produced a housing unit. So whether it's rental assistance through TBRA, whether it's helping with larger developments like Crystal View, we have to have an affordable housing unit at the end of the project time. Typically you'll also notice there's CHOTO set aside, which right now we have 2 CHOTOs, First Followers and Habitat for Humanity. Those fundings have to go to a CHOTO, otherwise we lose that money. It's not like it can be absorbed into those other projects. And then what the consortium has agreed to do is, like this year we gave additional funding for Courage Connection and this gun violence program. That TBRA allocation, because it serves consortia-wide, that's taken off the top. So it's, admin, CHOTO, and then those TBRA type programs. And then the balance is split proportionally by population.
Okay. All right. Any other technical questions? All right. Jaya?
This is I think may have already been addressed, but just to clarify, when you were talking about correcting the dates, there are some places where it says FY22-22. Is that also just an error, or is that?
Yes,
Okay.
that was just an
Okay,
error.
and
I
so those
apologize.
kinds of corrections have
Yes.
been, okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
again, it's all submitted through that IDIS system, so all the corrections have been made in there, and then I'll update the draft as well so that they match. That was just an error on my part. I apologize.
Grace?
Thanks. Just had another one about the transitional housing with those 3 houses operated with the city. Am I reading it correct? And again, apologize not going through all the final version yet. That you're having another organization do some of the case management, and I'm just kind of wondering how you do that application process and get families in there as well.
We reached out to, excuse me, Housing Authority, Shelter Plus Care Program, and RPC to see if they had existing clients who could utilize our program, because they already provide the case management. With our staffing just being Braden and I, we don't have the ability to do case management on the clients, and they would be much more in depth than what we're able to give. And so that's kind of what we did the years of COVID. And once they identified clients, then the clients can take their voucher anywhere. And some of them looked at our units and decided they didn't meet their needs or whatever, and others did. And so we were able to fill all 3 units.
Okay, so it's people using the vouchers in those properties instead of like an outside program. And then they doing case management through RPC or the other partners as well?
Oh, yeah, they're doing them through their individual programs. One's with Housing Authority, one's with Shelter Plus Care, and the other one is through Regional Plan Commission.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no more technical questions, I'd entertain a motion. Grace?
I would move resolution number 2022-04-034R, resolution approving the City of Urbana Home Consortium, Champaign-Urbana, Champaign County Annual Action Plan for fiscal year 2022 to 2023. I'd like to put it on regular agenda with no recommendation, just because I may have more questions for you guys throughout the week, if you don't mind, when I get through the final plan.
I'll second.
So that was moved by Grace and seconded by Jaya. Is there any discussion? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right, that's unanimously passed to the regular agenda to City Council. Thank you very much, Sheila and Braden. The next item, so just giving a heads up, so we're gonna do one more resolution, and then we'll have go back to the presentation. So resolution number 2022-04035R, resolution appointing the interim human resource manager as the authorized agent for the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund from 2022. Elizabeth.
So as you may know, city employees who are eligible for a pension and do not participate in the police and fire pension funds participate in the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. So it's IMRF is the acronym that we use for that. So IMRF requires that the city council designate someone to be our registered agent. And since we have had some turnover in HR, Famie Fletcher is currently our interim HR manager, and so this would just designate the interim HR manager as our registered agent and give her the ability to approve all the various forms and paperwork that need to be approved to manage our participation.
All right, any questions for Elizabeth? Can I have a motion?
I'll move approval of resolution number 2022-04-035R, a resolution appointing the interim human resources manager as the authorized agent for the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund 2022 to City Council on a consent agenda.
I'll second.
Moved by Chandra, seconded by Sharice. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right, that moves on to the consent agenda with a unanimous vote. We will move on to number 10 on our agenda, which is resolution number 2022-04-036R, a resolution approving an intergovernmental agreement with the Housing Authority of Champaign County for media production services. Stanford?
Good evening. The resolution here is to approve an intergovernmental agreement, and this is a standard intergovernmental agreement we have in place with several other entities in the area, including the Park District, the Urbana School Board, Board of Education for USD 116. In these cases, UPTV provides services to record and broadcast their meetings. So this formalizes that relationship with the Housing Authority of Champaign County. We had this agreement in place from 2019. I said till 2020, but when I looked it up, they actually terminated at the end of 2019. But we had this agreement in place. Then they asked to end it, and then they reached out to us again in August of last year and asked us to put it back in place. So we were not able in August to staff. We had transitions going on in UPTV, and we picked up the discussion in March, and we have pulled up the intergovernmental agreement, dusted it off, so to speak, cleaned up some verbiage, and we are asking for approval. So the key services that we're delivering for the Housing Authority are to have someone go to the meetings, to record the meetings. We then bring it back here, we download it, we edit it, and put it on the air on UPTV. The option exists for the Housing Authority to then engage with us for other video production services. That is as they seek it. And it's just an open-ended, if they have something they want to do, they'll notify us, we go back and forth, we clarify it, and we do the work and bill them later. But for the meetings that we're doing, it's 12 meetings. We have a standard rate of 3 hours of effort. And as the IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement notes, the schedule of fees includes a rate for media production services. Currently, that rate is $50 an hour. So whatever the current rate is in the schedule of fees is what the IGA will use. And the IGA will renew automatically from year to year.
Technical questions. Charisse?
Yeah. Do we have the staff to do this?
So we use part-time camera operators to record these meetings. They are not full-time staff, and in fact, most of them work somewhere in the range of 6 hours a week for the city. Most all of them have different jobs as well. So we use part-time camera operators, and just for a second to speak about that role, it's a wonderful role. We have, over time, had a good series of people who have gotten involved with UPTV through the camera operator position and have progressed and stayed with UPTV for several years, sometimes moving into different positions. It's also a wonderful way for Parkland students or other people who are studying video production to get some real world experience. So
Okay, yeah, that was going to be my next question is if we use, if there's some kind of intern, something where students that are in film production, sound production, any of that kind of stuff, where they are utilized to do those particular other, because didn't we also used to film and program rather, or whatever, like our band of basketball games and football games and stuff like that?
So many of those production efforts were really, Jason Liggett was the heart and soul of UPTV, creating those relationships with the school board, getting students involved in recording those. Those were done actually by people from the schools, the students, along with Jason's support. These people who we're talking about for these meetings are paid employees of the city.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Grace?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. One of my questions was about the cost, which you answered. I'm not seeing where it says that in the contract. I didn't know if...
The last page of the intergovernmental agreement references the schedule of fees. And the schedule of fees is updated yearly by the city, and the current rate is $50. So the $50 does not appear, it just points to the schedule of fees. I believe it's page, Schedule A, page 8? Yes.
So it's not in here, you're saying available on the website?
I'm sorry, ask Gwen?
I see addendum A, schedule of fees, just says that applies to the contract will always be the current effective schedule maintained by the city available on its website. So you're saying it's not in here, but on the website, it's where it says the 12 meetings for 3 hours for $50 an hour?
No, that the 12 meetings is based on the meeting schedule of the Housing Authority. We have other entities who we deal with who meet less frequently, but in their case, it's 12 meetings. So we send them an invoice at the beginning of the year for the 12 meetings times 3 times 50.
Okay, and you're saying the $50 an hour is what's on the website as the standard UPTV charges? Okay, thank you. And then you said that this would be going to a separate location for their meetings with the Housing Authority, so it wouldn't have to interfere or schedule conflicts with all the other city meetings here. Is that right?
Correct, right. The meetings are recorded at their location on North Market Street in Champaign.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if there's no further questions, can I have a motion?
I'd like to move for consent agenda, the resolution number 2022-04-036R, resolution approving an intergovernmental agreement with the Housing Authority of Champaign County for media production services. We move to City Council consent agenda for approval.
Second.
All right, moved by Sharice and seconded by James. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Although that moves on to City Council on the consent agenda with a unanimous vote from the committee. Thank you very much. All right, the next item is resolution number 2022-04037R, a resolution approving the allocation of ARPA standard allowance from the Executive Department. I believe the mayor is going to give an introduction.
Just a brief introduction, and then Will Kolchowski will be presenting for staff. It was rightly pointed out earlier in the meeting that addressing shortages in public sector revenue is one of the major categories for which the ARPA funds were originally designed, and including provision of city services as being an allowable expense. What changed from last year to January of this year was, and it was actually good news for cities our size, because the original U.S. Treasury rules for calculating revenue loss and everything were just unbelievably complicated, and the government started hearing from cities about how basically cities our size did not have the ability to even do those calculations because of the complexity and the amount of staff and time it would take. So the good news was in January, the Treasury released information about the standard allowance, and that allowed up to $10 million to be allocated for addressing revenue shortfalls. The bad news, and we were basing our original discussion of the standard allowance on that information. The bad news that we received later in the spring was that we had to make a decision by this month, by the April 30th reporting period, if we were going to use this, and it was now or never. So that's what brings us here to tonight. Will go into much more detail, but I want to say this now, and we'll say it several times during this presentation, is that what we're voting on tonight is the approach, whether or not we will use the standard allocation. Votes on actual expenditure of any of these funds in the standard allocation, as well as all the other ARPA funds, will be taken later. It will still require a separate vote by City Council. So this is a consideration of, will we use this approach to address shortfall in revenues that we've experienced, and to address that impact on the city. And no, we're not going for $10 million. We're not even talking about $6.5 million anymore. So I'll turn this over to Will.
Thank you, Mayor. So when you go on out of town for the holiday, the mayor steals your first 3 bullet points on your talking points. But so I do have one slide later, so I'm in the hot seat. But I'll kind of, without going over, everything in the memo, I'll kind of try to talk about, how we got to where we are, kind of the past discussion, and then kind of talking about lost revenue a little bit, and then we'll go over the options. So as the mayor said, the gist of why we're here tonight is on the April 30th project and expenditure report. It says that we are required to make a decision on what revenue replacement method we choose, and then if we choose the standard allowance, how much up to that $10 million that we have. So you kind of going back to when all the ARPA funds were originally, the legislation came out, the Treasury had an interim rule, and that's kind of the rule we've been operating since, in May when it came out. And just also, for ARPA funds, you have till the end of the year of 2024 to decide how you're going to spend them, and then the end of year 2026 to actually spend that money. So that's kind of the framework we've been operating under, is those timelines and the interim rule. So in January, there was the final rule, and then what came from the final rule was a new method for calculating revenue replacement, which is the standard allowance, which, again, it makes it much easier to do it. You just kind of, instead of having to do the multi-year calculation, you just kind of take your figure. And that happened in January, and then leading up to the final guidance on the reporting for the report that's due at the end of this month that came out a couple weeks ago was it said that, you have to decide in this report, what method you're choosing and how much it is. So that's kind of how we got to where we are. So kind of past discussions about, revenue replacement. There's been a lot of informal, discussion of, we talked at council meetings when it first, especially when it first came out. This is this municipal relief fund. This is, to help cities get through the pandemic. But then we came to council, or the mayor came to council with a presentation on February 28th, kind of with a proposal of what the city was thinking about for what we would take as revenue replacement under the standard allowance. And this was $6.5 million was presented at this time, and that included $2.5 million that was, related to the revenue loss, especially kind of thinking about the census impact going forward. And then it also included $4 million for some other projects and expenditures, such as the Park District facility, the fire stations at that time. So, that was just kind of a presentation. It wasn't, the final formal discussion. It was kind of the starting off point in our process. And kind of at that meeting, there was some apprehension about including, taking funds as part of the standard allowance for projects that would otherwise be eligible for ARPA funds, and kind of part of the process that we agreed to. So, all of those other projects, generally speaking, are ARPA eligible. The Park District facility, on a couple different ways, the fire stations, especially with the new final rule, capital expenditures, as long as you meet other eligibility criteria, would be eligible. The administrative costs that were identified in there are also just generally ARPA eligible. So kind of that other $4 million that was part of that presentation are eligible. So kind of moving on to revenue loss, the mayor was talking about the original calculation, which was, it was intensive. You had to take, a starting off point, and then you take all business revenue, which isn't all of your revenue. You got to figure out which revenue qualifies, and then you figure out what the difference was, for a variety, and you do that for each year of the reporting period. For a variety of reasons that, it's not particularly useful in our scenario. I mean, a lot of things are clouded. A lot of state transfers are included. So, if we get some money, so example is we got some money from the state for the capital bill a couple years ago that was passed. So that counts as revenue that came in last year. So it kind of gives a fuzzy picture. It doesn't, our census loss isn't incorporated into that. And then, there's also rising costs that kind of, it doesn't really incorporate the increased expenditures that we've had as well. So for a lot of reasons, the old methodology really wasn't, it's not ideal to use that. So the standard allowance is just a much simpler methodology, especially when we think about the census and our future losses going forward. So I think kind of talking about, when we're talking about loss revenue, I think this is where we have a couple slides that our finance department put together. And Elizabeth, can you guys see these?
Yeah, but we need the slideshow version. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, so just two quick slides just to kind of help explain sort of where we were pre-pandemic versus where we are at this point. So this information was pulled directly from the financial forecast that we did in 2020. And some of you weren't even seated on the city council at that point in time. But this was the point in time where, after years of hard work, literally, revenue increases and expenditure reductions, we kind of breathed a sigh of relief, and we said, we finally have a structurally balanced budget. Things look good going forward. A couple of months later, we had a global pandemic, and that kind of changed everything. So what this chart shows is our forecast, oh, go back, please. Our forecasted recurring expenditures in the orange compared to our policy goal, which is now and has been for a long time, 98.5% of recurring revenues. And you can see that our recurring revenues exceed our recurring expenditures and only kind of way out towards the end of the 5 years till those things start to come together. So there's a small gap at the end, but we were 2.7 million to the good over that 5-year period. So now this information, different presentation, but this comes from the financial forecast that you saw earlier this year. So again, this is balance of recurring expenditures versus our policy goal. And you may notice that the forecast recurring expenditures are above the policy goal. So this is completely opposite where we would like to be. And that situation continues throughout the 5-year period. So the shaded area between the lines is the gap between that policy goal and where our recurring expenditures are. And over that period, that total is estimated at $3.2 million. So I know when we talked about the forecast, we talked about the fact that we do have some excess fund balance above our 25% goal, which is our new policy. And that money over the years, we've used that to pay for one-time expenses. We've used millions to fund additional capital improvements that otherwise would not have happened over the past several years. So we can spend down fund balance to bridge that gap, at least partially, and that was what we talked about at the time we did the forecast. But we run the risk, if we do that, of hitting a wall where there's no more fund balance to spend down. And depending on how many one-time expenditures we want to fund, how many additional capital transfers we want to make, other kinds of things that may come up, the more of those things we do, the closer we get to hitting that wall where we can't continue to spend down fund balance. On top of that, I'm going to say, and I'm sure you all keep tabs on the news, but there's increasing discussion about probability of another recession in the offing. So that's something that has changed since we talked about the forecast that is also concerning and impacts this picture. So if we rely on fund balance, we move closer to the point where we would potentially not be able to maintain current services to our residents. Closing that gap, however we choose to do that, allows us to provide that predictable level of basic government services. We're talking about things like infrastructure maintenance and public safety services. If we don't close the gap, I think our risk is that we either have to increase revenues to continue to provide services, or potentially at some point we have to make budget reductions, which reduces services. So I just wanted to kind of tie this all into where we have been, where we think we are now in relation to our financial situation.
Kind of tying back into the census, so that the 3,000 people that we lost, since a lot of our revenue that we get is given to us from the state on a per capita basis, the income tax, the use tax, and our motor fuel fund, or some of the motor fuel tax. So from the general fund, it's about $500,000 a year that we won't be getting because of that loss of population. And then there's I think 115,000 in the motor fuel fund that's less than we would have got if we had that full population. So that's kind of you can see it very clearly. So you can see that pretty clearly in that graph in front of you. So with the standard allowance, the mechanics is generally pretty simple. The revenue replacement can pay for any general governmental service, which they give you pretty much leeway. They say, any service that the government typically provides is fine. So, in our instance, since the general fund, pays for all these services, the money's coming out of that one. And talking with folks at the RBC, and with the standard allowance, it's as simple as you just put in the general fund, and then it goes in there, and it's part of our regular governmental services. So that's where the ease of from the financial and reporting side of the standard allowance comes into play, in addition to the calculation. So then, what you see in front of you are a couple options that we've presented, just, kind of talking about, what you could do and then what, kind of the outcomes of that decision are. So I chose the three big chunks there, though, theoretically you can choose any number in between 0 and 10 million. So from one perspective, you could decide to take all $10 million of the standard allowance. So the positive of this is you have a lot of financial flexibility, especially on the reporting side. It's just very easy. You don't have to keep filling out reports and track, according to the Treasury's reports. It's very simple. The downside to this then would be, it's kind of deviates from our agreed upon process, and so it doesn't prohibit spending any of your newfound financial security on ARPA goals that would come through the concept plan. But it just kind of takes, an extra communicative step and to kind of make that clear to everybody and, follow through on that promise if that's what you want to do. But, that is an option. And then we presented the $2.5 million option as well. And that's kind of the middle of the road, kind of balances the city's financial needs from a financial security standpoint, as well as trying to keep as much of the money as possible as part of the allocation or the regular ARPA process. And of course, there's also the option of taking an standard allowance of 0 and keeping it all for ARPA as part of the process. Now, the downside of this one is for all of ARPA's flexibility, especially with the final rule being even more flexible. As a rough rule of thumb, general governmental services, aren't always eligible for ARPA funding. So if you elect not to do the standard allowance, and then in the future, if the economic circumstances change, you can't go backwards and then use ARPA to pay for general governmental services. So whereas now if you decided to take a standard allowance for the financial security, that doesn't prohibit you from spending other monies on ARPA priorities. But if you don't take it, and then you can't kind of go backwards and then use ARPA funds for governmental services at a later date. So the recommendation that you have outlined in front of you is for the $2.5 million, although it says, you can elect a standard allowance more than that. There's a trade-off from a project management perspective, but there's not necessarily a downside to taking more than $2.5 million, from that perspective. So that's all I have if there's any questions.
All right, questions for Will? Chris?
Thanks for the presentation. Your voice kind of got a little low at a point where you were describing, I guess I wanted to define, could you define again the state transfer, the 3,000 people that were missing causes this $500,000 missing money, and you said state income tax and what else?
State income tax, state use tax, and the motor fuel fund. There might be another small one, maybe the cannabis as well. So the way the state collects that money, on your sales tax, they collect the sales and use tax that gets remitted to the Department of Revenue, and then I think it's quarterly for all of them, or there's a delay. The state on a per capita basis, I think these are all, Elizabeth can correct me if I'm wrong, part of the local government distributive fund. And so they give that money to municipalities back. So that's where we get the per capita distributions from. So the state collects it, and then they give it back out to municipalities on a per capita basis.
Okay. Let me see if I might have had one more question. Oh, so what we're voting on tonight is that we're going to we might set aside $2.5 million to the city budget that we can't do for some reason. We can't do it later. And if we set aside this money, could we decide later that, we don't want to put it to the city budget, we want to put it to something else? Is that a possibility?
So what the vote is on the report that's due April 30th, I have to tell the RPC, the person who does reporting, what number to figure out. So in order for the city to tell them what number to put out in the standard allowance, that's what we're deciding today. From the ARPA perspective, once it becomes revenue replacement, it's no longer ARPA money and it's the city's money. So how, you want to spend, your newfound financial security would come at a later date as part of the budget process. So if, you're looking forward, you think you have recurring expenditures you want to pay for until census, that would be one option. If there's other things, that's an option as well. But that's a discussion for a later date.
Okay. Last question. Carol or Diane, what services would be cut if we didn't have that 2.5?
Well, since this general operating fund pays for just about every day-to-day operation in the city, we haven't identified which services would be cut at this point, but that would be considered. And I can't emphasize enough the impact of the 2020 census. We're literally looking at just between general fund and motor fuel tax, over 600,000 annually lost because of the 7% official loss in our population, and that doesn't include the impact on CDBG and HUD funds. So we are looking at a real, actual loss in revenue, and we may or may not decide to do the special census. We haven't analyzed the benefit cost of that, but the cost of a special census is completely borne by the city. The Census Bureau does not do it, and it's not retroactive. So even if we do a special census, regain some or all of our lost population, it's not retroactive. So the $2.5 million really reflects the $600,000 a year for 4 years, roughly, of lost revenue that we are going to see due to our lower census numbers. What you have before us tonight is number one, if you take the standard allowance, as I said, all you're doing is voting on the approach. You're not allocating one dime tonight to anything. I would foresee not even moving $2.5 million in 1 year from the ARPA money into the general fund. It could be done over several years, and that way we can see how things are going. But to do the at least this amount in the standard allowance actually gives us the flexibility to address revenue shortfall and maintain city services, but it also gives you the flexibility to change your mind later, because it's in the general fund. And in the general fund, you can do, what you want.
Would each time that we allocate money from that 2.5, would that be a council vote every time, or how would
Yes.
that go?
It would have to be part of the budget, right? So you would either have to approve it when you adopt the budget, or there would have to be a budget amendment.
So yes, you'll vote on it.
Elizabeth, would the 2.5, if we approved it as part of the budget, would it be put in each department, or how would that look if it's in just the budget?
So I can't answer that question. So I don't think we would just immediately start, allocating 2.5 million, because as the mayor said, the revenue loss isn't all at once, right? It happens over time, but we would have to take a look at that as part of finalizing the budget.
So just a couple points of clarification, because I feel like I've heard a couple different things. One is if we're voting to have that 2.5 moved over, that's the 2.5, it's not up to, correct?
The resolution is for 2.5.
Right.
Yes.
And so then further clarification of if it is moved to the standard, allowance, thank you. Once it's there, it's not that we're voting on what happens to it once it's there. We're voting to move it there, and then the city would decide as part of overall budgeting where that needs to go for city purposes. And that could happen next fiscal year, that could happen over a number of fiscal years. Okay. Thank you.
And the beauty of that is we can see how our revenue, what the financial situation, what the financial picture is over the next few years. And it will be tracked. We will keep track of it. I think we do have a good process, the concept plan, the idea to be intentional about this, and we will try to follow this as closely as we can. It's just that, like everything related to COVID, you get something put into place, and then something changes. And in this case, it was the federal government changing the rules several times. And that was in direct response to what cities were telling the U.S. Treasury. So we're bringing this to you tonight because we have to respond to the choice that we're given.
Sharice?
Yeah, okay. Question is kind of a point of clarification as well. So regarding, this is my understanding, regarding the 2.5 mil, that's kind of what we are voting on is if we're going to do it at all.
If we're taking that approach.
If we're going to take that approach.
Yes.
So if we're taking that approach, these funds, and basically it is due, the census, COVID, so much stuff I know affected the budget for the city. In particularly the census, based on the fact that was like $1,500 per person that for a period of 10 years. So that's like $15,000 per person of revenue, not just revenue, but possible representation, possible a lot of other things that will affect the city. So the 2.5 mil will help to rectify, hopefully, some funds that we could possibly be losing based on the fact that we've lost that population.
Yes, it'll help offset the losses. Yeah.
That's
which
all
was one of the original, and I was on some of the earliest conference calls with representatives from Treasury and other mayors and other cities, and that is one of the original purposes of the American Rescue Plan Act. And the American Rescue Plan Act is way bigger than just funding to the cities, direct funds to cities, but we lobbied very heavily to get direct funds for the cities because we didn't know what was coming, and we didn't know what the impact of the pandemic would be or how long it would last. And cities were saying, everyone else is seeing funding. We need at least to have some direct funds for the cities to help offset potential revenue loss and to help for city recovery. So that's what we're talking about tonight. But again, there's no vote on allocating 1 cent of this, or spending 1 cent. This is simply, do you want to give yourself the flexibility of this approach? And I think we should.
James?
So if we approve this, and in our next report we say 2.5 million is going to be used in this way, should I think of that as being added to our fund balance, or are we going to track it in a separate fund?
So when you say fund balance, I think you're talking about the general fund. So the answer in the near term is no, because all of our ARPA revenue is going in a special fund just for ARPA money, right? And so in order for that to be, any part of it to be distributed anywhere, it would have to be transferred from the ARPA fund into the general fund, into the local motor fuel tax fund, wherever we decide to place it.
So it's going to stay in the ARPA fund until we decide what we're going to spend on it, or are we going to just move it once we make that report?
No, we can't just move it because it's part of the budget. So you're either going to, I don't see us doing anything before the end of this fiscal year, so there might be a piece of it perhaps that gets moved in next fiscal year's budget. So you would approve that as part of the budget ordinance, or if not, then anything has to be approved by a budget amendment.
So the reason why I'm asking that question is, my next question is, since we're looking at this over a 4-year period, 5-year period, would the investment of this amount be added to this amount in the way we think of it?
I think what you're asking is, are we earning interest on the ARPA money? Yes.
And so, but if feels like we're going to segregate this $2.5 million and how we're going to approach it. Will we start keeping track of what interest that $2.5 million has earned separately to go along with it over time and how we spend it.
No, we track interest and investment income at the fund level.
So
So
that just all gets
that
bundled
just
together.
gets blended into the
And-
ARPA pot.
And then I guess my last question is, can we, because this, we're giving ourselves some freedom in how to use this if we adopt this in the future, right? Can we commit to, even though we're doing that and it's moving into a place where we'll have to budget it and it's part of the replacing the lost revenue, however you want to think about it, can we commit to tracking it so when it's all said and done, we will be able to say, this is how that $2.5 million, once we moved it across the line, ended up benefiting the city or addressing the needs that we expected it to after making this change?
We can figure some way to do that, yes. And I just want to make sure people understand, if you look in your budget document, there is a specific fund that has just the ARPA, the first half of the ARPA funds that we've received, which is approximately 6.4 something million, 6.5 million. And then we don't expect to get the second tranche until sometime in May. But it is segregated in the budget now. And again, every time anything moves from that particular fund to somewhere else, whether by the overall budget ordinance or a budget amendment, you'll vote on that as well.
So I'm going to ask one more question just to clarify in my mind. That means that even though we've partitioned it into this 2.5 million to be used in this approach, it will still stay in that larger collection of ARPA money until we actually budget it.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not
thank you.
voting on any expenditures tonight. You're
Thank
voting
you.
on an approach. And I know I keep saying that because it takes sometimes for me to hear things more than once.
So Elizabeth, I want to be clear. From what I'm hearing from everybody, we have one pool of ARPA funds, right? The 6.4 million plus hopefully the next 6.4 million. And what we're proposing to do is to cleave it into two buckets. One bucket which the city can then use to throughout the next couple of years in the budget, and then the other piece, the larger hunk, is for all of the other elements that we might fund through the RPC process. Is that
Yeah,
right? We're cleaving it off, right? We're cleaving the 2.5. It's still called ARPA money, but it's specifically for use by the city for general services.
Right, yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to describe it. In the end, it'll be broken into many, many more pieces.
Right,
but-
and that was the piece that I'm sitting here thinking about. I mean, I think that the state motor fuel tax is the easiest one for us to see what we had last year and what we have this year based on per capita. The other ones are a little bit harder, and so I was just trying to think operationally how this would work as we go through and build a budget. We're certainly not going to say that, $10 of ARPA funds went to pay Elizabeth's salary, right? We're not going to go line by line and say which part of it, right? But rather, what I kind of see is saying we have this shortfall because we didn't earn as much money, right? Based on all of these per capita things, that shortfall is $250,000 this year. We're going to put that into our budget for this year. We're going to move that in, and then therefore, we would approve as city council the overall budget with the plan of moving the 250 out of that ARPA bucket. Is that correct?
Yes.
I just don't want people to think that we're going to sit here and line item approve every single dollar from that ARPA bucket. I think the general philosophy is that we have to estimate how much revenue we lost in year X, whatever that is. And we say this is an opportunity for us to take from that ARPA city bucket and offset that loss. So I just wanted to make that, okay, good. Then I think I understand what's going on. Chandra, did you have a question? Oh, Grace, I'm sorry.
Thanks for the clarifications. I was wondering, well, you said that if we didn't do the standard allowance that we couldn't take it later, and I'm just wondering, at least under the interim final rule, why it couldn't fit under that priority 6 of revenue replacement later.
So at this point, you have to decide which method you're doing on this report, standard allowance or the revenue replacement, the calculation. If you choose the revenue replacement, difficult calculation, that option would remain for future years. You know, for future reports, you could choose that revenue replacement option. But, you know, kind of, I was talking a little bit, I think, you know, my words are in my mouth, but, you know, using that method, it's difficult, and when it lumps everything together, you know, the census impact kind of gets muted, and you know, you don't necessarily, you won't see the true, you know, impact, especially when you think about recurring revenues and one-time revenues. You know, there's no guarantee that you actually, using the calculation methods that the Treasury says you have to use, that you'll find a revenue loss using their calculation. So that is an option, but then the kind of the risk is that it won't show up there.
Thank you. And then I was wondering, 'cause it sounds like we're saying that this is just the standard allowance method, and we'll talk about more details of how those funds are used later. And I was wondering, is because it sounded like it was kind of, we talked about it would be part of the budget process, and we talked about it would be part of the RPC process with the other ARPA spending. So I'm wondering if we could have a more clear answer on like when or how we might figure out that allocation within a potential 2.5 standard allowance.
I don't know that I can answer that question right now. I don't think it's particularly urgent, right? Because as I said, we can spend down fund balance for a while, right? So it's not urgent, like we have to make this decision in the next few months.
Correct. Yeah, I just want to be sure that we do have a clear kind of expectation on when or how we would do that. I think some of the concerns is just that it could be easy for some of those funds to get into the general fund and then kind of disappear in the noise of everything else going on and not have as much kind of transparency or accountability to the public about where that money's going in particular. And yeah, so I think that would be helpful to also know what's kind of remaining. Like if there's something that, you know, like potentially maybe $5,000 a year for hybrid meetings related to COVID that we don't have, you know, those funds, but then sometimes we have funds for way bigger projects. And so some of the budgeting in the general fund seems a little mysterious to me, and I think it would be great to have a little more transparency, although we might not be federally required with a standard allowance to show what we do plan and actually spend those monies on.
Well, in general, every vendor that we pay, you see in the monthly list of bills that's sent to City Council and that's posted. It's also visible in our budget. So when people ask, and I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but when people ask, how are you spending money, we can point to, here's the list of expenditures on a monthly basis, and that is what we spend money in the general fund on. And again, general fund is mostly salaries because we pay people to do the work of the city, but there are also other expenses. Capital budget, it's kind of easier to deal with because it's, you know, they're more discrete projects. But as far as transparency, publicly, there is a great deal of data available publicly as far as how we spend the money in the general fund. So that's, but as Mary Alice pointed out, we won't be going down to the, you know, dollar per dollar. If we're using this to maintain general services, we will use it in the general operating fund to maintain services to the city or to the community.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that also some of that problem could be that there's so much information of like every expenditure out of the general fund doesn't really tell the public what funds came from that COVID ARPA allowance versus not. So I understand it's not going to be every single item, but like we talked about, transfer X tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars to state motor fuel fund, to this operational fund, so that the public kind of has an overview, not every single item, but where that money came from and what it covered, instead of just looking at the general fund of everything and not knowing where it came from.
Anytime there's a transfer from the separate ARPA fund, which includes the $2.5 million, if that's what's chosen to do, that will be a transfer that is done here, or as part of the budget process.
So I just want to maybe say words in a little different way, just to make sure that everybody's understanding what's being said. So it's very discreet to follow something that gets transferred into the local motor fuel fund because that's a separate fund, right? And it has certain things that we spend it on. And there may be other discrete funds that you all decide, okay, we're going to take some of that ARPA money and we're going to put it in this fund, and we're going to put it in that fund, and we're going to put it in that fund. But then when we get to the general fund, which pays for a lot of stuff, I think of it this way, and I think of it with the graph that Elizabeth did, is there may be a shortfall. And so we have a bucket that has a water line, and we're below the water line, and we need it to be up to the water line in order to fulfill all the services. And so we're not going to be figuring out which drop of water, we just need to fill the bucket back up, and then that bucket of water pays for all of the things that are paid out of the general fund. Those decisions get made by the council, and then the direction about how those get spent are also made by the council, and you'll have the same, I would say, granularity of decision making as you have now. It won't be a greater granularity of decision making because it's ARPA money to put funds into whatever bucket, and then whatever gets paid out of that bucket, you approve those expenditures through the budget. And anything beyond that we wouldn't have anything in terms of your decision making that would go deeper than that, unless there was something called out by the council.
In the actual budget document that we get, there's always a pie chart that tells us where the money is coming from for the general fund. How much is from the property tax? How much is from the sales tax? There's a whole pie chart that says the general fund is comprised of these different sources of income. What I envision in the next budget draft is we're going to have a new slice that says ARPA, right? So here's the pie with no ARPA money, and it equals $100 million. It doesn't, let's say $30 million. Here's the pie with an ARPA sign, and now it's 32 million, whatever the numbers may be. So the transparency in that regard, in terms of the source of income, will be at that level. Does that make sense, Grace? Okay.
And just to remember, I'm sorry, I should raise my hand.
Go ahead.
Just to remember, the other 10.5 million will be subject to the process that you've agreed to do as much as we can stick with it, depending on the urgency and the need. So this, we're talking about one small piece of the overall funding we expect to get.
All right, we're getting a lot into discussion, but I'm just curious if we have any technical questions before we move on. All right, if there's no more technical questions, can I have some kind of motion so we can move on to discussion?
I'll move approval of resolution number 2022-04-037R, a resolution approving the allocation of the ARPA standard allowance to the regular agenda for city council approval.
I'll second.
Moved by Chandra and seconded by Sharice. Discussion. Jaya.
Yeah, I think, even in the questions, it was pretty clear that people would like to know, even as we're talking about those buckets, which bucket it's moving into and when. I think that provides just an extra level of oversight. I think it is important to recognize that this is in keeping with the initial intent of ARPA, and it doesn't take away from the fact that we still have a lot of money to use that process that we have established. I think, the cost of the impact of the census is not a small thing to just brush aside, and having the ability to use this money to make sure that we are maintaining our city services. To me, this is a direct impact of the pandemic, right? Like the way the census went down, there's a connection there to, what was happening in our community during the pandemic. And so making sure that while that census number may be inaccurate, we are still able to maintain our city services, and this allows us a little bit more flexibility to do so, while we are also stipulating very specific expectations in terms of oversight. I think that there's a good balance with this particular amount.
James?
Yeah, I really appreciate the sharing of the philosophy at how we got to 2.5 million, the costs involved and why we got to that. I think this is a reasonable, maybe even a conservative approach to taking this path. And I hope we don't wonder in 2 or 3 years why we didn't do 3 million or 3.5 million in this process. But I trust the advice that we've been given based on the logical why this amount is there, and so I'm intending to support this.
Other discussion, Grace?
Thank you. Thanks for all the clarifications and information on this. And I also just want to go on record saying that aside from this, I think that we need to have all the community proposals or ideas evaluated equally and not have any one or two skipping the process that we've set in place for everyone else. So I think if we need to work on speeding up that process for some reason, we need to do it for everyone and not just a certain group or two. And then I also just wanted to express some things about how I felt about a few parts of the memo that I found misrepresentative. It says in there twice that we discussed this with council on the proposed things, and I just wanted to clarify that that was a presentation. We didn't take any questions on it. We went straight into another presentation. It was not a discussion item. There was no discussion on it. So I find that a little misrepresentative. And then also saying that there was no feedback or concerns expressed. I did express some, and I think another council member too as well. We had to wait until council input because, again, it was a presentation and not a discussion, so there was no discussion. Just made it feel a little unheard and a little misrepresentative of what happened. So I just wanted to encourage us to maybe consider that, and if we do want to have a discussion with council, let's schedule it as a discussion and not a presentation and not take any questions and then say that we didn't have any discussion or input from council because we weren't given the opportunity. So I would just recommend considering that for the future. And also, I understand, the importance of recovering the revenue loss from the census and that 7% can be a big deal in our overall operations. And I think it's important to maintain the city services, as we struggle already with snow and streets and leaf pickup and all of the things that are important city services. So I do understand the need for this, and I just hope that we can follow through with the expenditures in a way that's as clear and transparent and accessible to the public as we can make it from there. Thank you.
Any other discussion? All right, seeing none, the motion on the table is to move this forward to City Council with a recommendation for approval on the regular agenda. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
All right, that is 5 yeas and 1 nay. And that moves forward. 6. Thank you. 6 yeas, 1 nay. All right, the last item on our agenda is council input and communication. Oh, whoops. There's another one. All right. One more ordinance. Ordinance number 2022-04014, an ordinance repealing we're repealing an ordinance number 2020-04021 pertaining to ratification of emergency order 20-02. Executive Carol or Diane, who's going to be talking about this one?
As you recall, in the early months of the pandemic, the City Council passed a number of emergency orders to respond to various issues that came up. One of those issues was the response time for ambulances as well as staffing of the private ambulance services. And so during the pandemic, we passed emergency order number 2002 related to ambulance services. And what that emergency order provided was that we would suspend two things. One, it would allow ambulances that were operated by private companies to be staffed at a minimum level with 2 EMT basic certified individuals. And then the second item that was suspended in our agreements was that the penalties would be waived if response times fell below the 90% threshold. And that was considered to be necessary just to address the reality of where the ambulances were stationed and the staffing levels that they had. And again, we have private ambulance companies in Urbana, 2 that operate in the city of Urbana. That's no longer necessary, and we're going to return to the requirements outlined in our city code. So what I would ask this to be repealed.
All right, questions, Grace?
Thanks. I was just wondering if you've heard any feedback on this, like from the ambulance providers or the hospitals. WCIA was asking me to do an interview about it, and I didn't even, understand what their interest on the community level perspective is. So I just was interested about, feedback and possible like concerns or controversy or interest on this particular piece, or why, what makes it that it's the COVID not having such an impact on them anymore, like what that's based on.
It's based on the lower rates of transmission of COVID at this point and the impact on staffing. And this was done in conjunction with the consultation with the fire department, the fire chief who's in contact with the ambulance companies.
So hearing from them that it's not an impact for them anymore, and you haven't heard any concerns about why it would be a problem
No,
to
to my
repeal it?
knowledge. And this was a recommendation from the fire chief, yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, can I have a motion?
Sure, I will move ordinance number 2022-04-014, an ordinance repealing ordinance 2020-04-021 pertaining to ratification of emergency order 20-02 to council on a consent agenda for approval.
Second. Moved by James, seconded by Sharice, I think, just by a second there. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right. Did you say that moved on consent agenda? Yes. All right. So that is approved unanimously onto the consent agenda. So now we are on the final item, which is council input and communication. Would anybody like to provide any input this evening? Grace?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify a piece about the Dr. Ellis subdivision presentation, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I'm not sure if I'm reading this correctly, but what was sent in that packet of information from Mr. Robert Lewis was that there was a petition of 96 residents in 2013, I believe. And I may be misinterpreting this as like not what I had said earlier, but they say that they would recommend that the city of Urbana should pay all costs incurred for repairs, materials, and labor to the sewer lines, including removal and replacement of the street pavement, sidewalks, curbs, et cetera, all the way up to where the main is. So I think I might be incorrectly interpreting that as a full replacement or repair, but I think whatever that suggestion is something that I would like to have an estimated cost on. So if I'm not understanding that request correctly, I think that's fine, but whatever that request is that was on that petition and some of the other points brought up in here is what I would be interested in having those kinds of estimates of cost for. Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other council input? Sharice, you look like you're getting ready to say something. No? Jaya?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to take a moment in terms of discussing the ARPA allocation process. I will say that I also had some concerns about how it was framed in the memo we discussed tonight. I think our previous discussion about the impact on the city, it was a presentation that was part of a larger package that didn't seem like it fit in the process that we had discussed up to that date. And I think it is important that we stick to that process that we have decided on. I think this piece is different because it's talking about a different allocation process that increases flexibility with those funds, and so there's a reason for it. So I think that as we're having these conversations, it's important for community members to know that process still is there. Anytime there's a deviation, there needs to be a very clear understanding of why there's a deviation. There are certainly other pressing issues that might warrant us making a different decision of how we are allocating those funds. So I really appreciated the level of detail in terms of why this 2.5 was recommended, why it was important to make this decision in this particular time frame, and I would expect and hope that any further conversations about deviating from the process that has already been determined would follow such a rigorous standard. So I appreciate that.
All right, James?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to the Southeast Urbana Neighborhood Association, which did a community cleanup on Colorado Avenue on Saturday, on Easter weekend, no less. And I understand members of the high school service club were invited to participate in that as well.
Chris?
Charlie Smythe was not my appointment. Borman was not my appointment. Phyllis Clark was not my appointment. Former city attorney James Simon was not my appointment. So I will take responsibility for Mr. Wesner and our current FOIA officer, Ross McNeil. And that leads to the question, Tracy, are you currently being designated a recurrent requester, and are you being denied currently, now, FOIA documents? So let us know if there's a problem now, and then we might deal with it. Otherwise, thank you, Carol, and thank you, Carla, for the presentation about CDAP tonight. Very important, and I appreciate you doing, and I see a lot of back work that you've done, so thank you.
All right, Diane.
I'd like to address the claims made by Tracy Chong tonight, and I reject what you said. I told the truth last summer, and it remains true today. When I had questions about remote meetings and options for remote public input, I did consult with the city attorney. I did consult with the Illinois Municipal League. Both had questions and were not certain at the time, and it currently stands today. The only authority we have in the city of Urbana to hold a remote meeting is by virtue of the authority of the statewide emergency declaration made by the governor, and that is renewed on a monthly basis. There was a bill in the Illinois General Assembly that failed to make it out this session that would have given individual municipalities an opportunity to make decisions about remote meetings on their own. But for you to say that I am lying, I reject entirely. That is not true, and you are wrong.
I'm sorry, this is council input right now. All right, so right now I need to know how many, does anybody else, I think everybody has had a chance to speak. Sharice is the only one who hasn't spoken. I need to know how many people will be gone next week. So we have 3 people gone next week. All right, so quorum is 4. Okay. Are you gone, Grace? No, 4. Yeah. Okay, with no further business in front of this committee, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.